Can everyone go ahead and start to take your seat? All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is going to be a really good and interesting talk. Thank you for everyone joining us tonight. My name is Joshua. I'm the community programs educator with the Wenatchee River Institute. Tonight we have Jeremy, who's going to be helping us with all the online hybrid part of it. And this will be recorded, so if you want to review it later on our YouTube channel, you can go there. And we also have Rebecca, who's supporting us on some of the beverage sales over there. So if you need a beverage, middle of the talk, she's the one to go to. So Wenatchee River Institute, we put on programs like this as part of our adult community programs, these Red Barn events. Our mission is to connect people, communities, and the natural world. And we do that by getting information and educating and making people feel like they're more connected to this place. And so we have different programs like this and workshops. We have a lichen workshop coming up with Don that he'll be leading. We have some tracking workshops and lots of things going on in our calendars. We also have youth programs side of our organization, and just today they were working with Brewster, driving all the way out there. We have a volunteer here in the audience that was helping out with that, so we have awesome volunteers, and they were going to a park out there to teach snow science and do snowshoeing. So lots of things that we're trying to reach out and connect communities. So another aspect of WI is that we connect Indigenous people to their ancestral lands. And we do this, one way that we do this is through our land acknowledgement. And so I'm going to read the land acknowledgement that we have. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shimpish-Squaxin people. We're spreading the message they wish to spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shimpish-Squaxin, Pesquotza, or Wenatchee people. The Shimpish-Squaxin, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as the Wenatchee and Okanagan Valleys. The culture and economy of the Shimpish-Squaxin people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shimpish-Squaxin are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shimpish-Squaxin now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shimpish-Squaxin people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they're connected to. The traditional language is Nhamchin, an interior Salish dialect, and we'd like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language, Tilhusht. Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying Indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the place you now call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for the Red Barn events, because without them, we wouldn't be able to operate these. Let me turn the slides here. And our sponsors. Our sponsors are Gustav's Grill and Beer Garden, Ludwig's German Restaurant, Obertal Inn, Cozy Handpicked Goods, South Restaurants, Hotel Pension Anna, München House, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, North Central Washington Audubon Society, Icicle Brewing Company, the Cove Resort at Fish Lake, Colchuck Consignment, Riverfront Rock Gym, Mountain Home Lodge, and Mitchell Reed and Spitten Insurance. Right, so now I'm gonna introduce our speaker. Don Schaechtel lives here in Leavenworth, and he is the past president of the Washington Native Plant Society. In 2020, Don took an interest in the life of Antoine Etienne, and he discovered a fascinating story, which he'll share with you. And he shared this presentation last year, and I was able to see it, and I was inspired by it. I thought this is so neat. This is local. It's a place that I can actually get out to and see what's out there. And so from Don's talk, I took a trip out there last June and just went up the creek, and there's all sorts of fascinating things out there. It's old mining equipment, flowers, wildflowers popping up, butterflies. It was just a beautiful space. And so I hope that you're maybe just as inspired as I was from Don's talk, and find it just as interesting. So let's welcome Don up here.
Thanks, Joshua.
Yeah.
It was really great when Joshua asked me if I would do this, that to hear that he went himself. So I want to encourage all of you, after seeing this, if that is exciting to you, by all means, make a trip. So Antoine Etienne was a name that probably most of you had not heard of. So it's kind of our contribution for Black History Month to tell you a little bit about him, and someone that lived right here and has a creek named after him. And that's yet another part of the story. So the several parts, we'll talk about Antoine Etienne as the pioneer and prospector and miner. And then we'll also talk about the creek, how to get there if you're interested in exploring it yourself. It's fascinating mining history, just a little bit on that, but also it's the diversity of its the flowers and plants that are there. So I hope you enjoy it, and you feel free to ask questions. And I hope it inspires you also. And one thing I'd like to mention, I know some of you have already mentioned that you've been there before. And when I did this presentation for the Washington Native Plant Society last year, in the chat was someone said, hey, I've got a friend whose family had a cabin there. And so I contacted him, and we got together with his friends. This is Paul Baylor and Mark Geddosh. I hope are watching by Zoom tonight. So thanks, guys. They came out, and Mark's family had a mining claim there. And as a boy, so this would have been, say, 40 to 50 years ago, he and his brother would be out there playing all day long. And what a great place as kids to explore this. They would visit with people that were mining there. They'd play in the creek, they could fish there. And their parents said, yeah, just be back by dinner time. And he and his brother would be out, and it was fun to see through his eyes some of the things there and how they changed. So I thought that was pretty neat. So if you have a story like that, it'd be great to hear it. So first, to make sure we're all on the same page on where Etienne Creek is there's Highway 2, and I got my pointer here. So Highway 2 up here with Leavenworth and Kashmir. So Peshastin would be right about here at the big Y, and then Highway US 97, and then Highway 90. So Blewett Pass is right about here. So Etienne Creek is one drainage south of Ingalls Creek. Probably, how many of you know where Ingalls Creek is? Probably most everybody. The landmark on Highway 97 is the Rock, right? That's our new landmark where you can stop and get a cold beer after your hike. And so just about a mile south, or 2 miles south of Ingalls Creek is this Etienne Creek drainage, which drains about 10 miles. It goes about 10 miles before it gets high in the mountains. If you've ever been in the North Fork Teanaway River area and are familiar with Navajo Pass, so Navajo Pass connects the Teanaway side with the Etienne Creek side. So, and then here's the enchantments, which you know, and so here's the Ingalls Creek drainage, and the Etienne Creek drainage is right here. So if you were to drive by today on Highway 97, this is what it would look like. And you may look at this and say, I've seen where that bridge used to be before. You see the bridge abutments. And, you know, I had seen that for years and never really thought about what creek it was. But this creek and I have had several, through the years, have had several interactions with each other, not really knowing where it was leading. So it used to be named Negro Creek. And it was on the maps. And I looked at it years ago as a approach to a peak called the Three Brothers. These are my compulsive peak bagging days. And so, but there was like no trailhead, no information about this thing. It was a dotted line on the Greasy Trails map, which it makes it kind of sketchy. And so we went in from the Etienne side, and it worked out just fine. In fact, probably worked out better. Definitely worked out better than going this way. And so that was my first time. But then the next time was in the Washington Native Plant Society, if you're familiar with that. One of the neat things that members have done through the years is put together plant lists for different trails in areas, parks and things. And so in 2010, 2 of our members had gone into this creek looking for a rare plant. And while they were there, they made a plant list. And in a short time, had identified 173 different species of plants. And that is a lot for 2.5 miles of creek that they traveled in. And so that kind of interested me. But when we put these plant lists on the University of Washington server, so they're more accessible, it's actually an interactive database now, which is kind of cool. That name, was that name, said, we can't put that in our database. So we had to change the name. So I said, well, maybe we could call it the trail number. And so I looked up the trail number and saw it was now called Etienne Creek. So problem solved. So I didn't think much of it then. But then WRI and the Wenatchee Valley Museum had hosted a diversity in the outdoors webinar in 2020. And so I participated in that. And one of the panelists was Karen Frances McWhite. And she lives here in Leavenworth. And a question posed to the panelists was what things can we do to encourage people of color to use the outdoors? And Karen had an interesting idea. She said, well, I think it'd be great if we had stories about Black outdoors people that we could share and that would encourage people. And she said, in fact, near where I live, she lived in Kashmir at the time, near where I live, there's a creek called Etienne Creek, and I understand it was named after a Black man. And so having my previous experiences with it, I never really thought this through. I said, wow, that's kind of interesting. So I made myself a little note. And a few months passed by, and I didn't think about it again, but I still had this note. So in the winter, I'm reading this book. Have anyone read East of the Divide by Chester Ball? Yeah, neat book. And Chester lives here in Leavenworth. And this book and it's at the library if you're interested in finding it. And he talks about his own adventures in the East Cascades, as well as history of some of the sheep runs they used to have, which is amazing to read about, and different people, whether they were explorers, miners, or whatever. And in reading this, I was really admiring the research he put in and learning about the areas that he was in. And about the same time is football season, right? So I'm watching football. University of Clemson that year had a really good team. Great running back. What was his name? Travis Etienne. So all this little serendipity, all these things are coming together. And so I contacted Karen and I said, hey, I think that was a great idea you had. What would you think about exploring who Antoine Etienne was? And she said, that is great. So we embarked on this quest. And so where would you imagine this day and age, where do you start if you're trying to find information, right? You go to the internet, right? So I Google up Antoine Etienne. Well, I found one hit on it, and it led me to several things, but I got these clues from different anecdotes, but they came from, the one hit I got was about changing the name to Etienne Creek. And it named the man who submitted the proposal, Jamie McDonald, who was a geology student at the time, but was now a professor at Gulf Coast University, which is in Tampa. And so you can find any professor, his information is going to be online. So I found it, sent him an email message, and I was real pleased. He replied back real fast and said, hey, he told me about it. We talked on the phone, and he led me to a couple other sources. And then that led me to the library. The librarian got me a couple other sources and actually found a lot of anecdotes about Antoine Etienne. And what was interesting is they're very inconsistent. And it's not all true, right? There's things that were, I was pretty skeptical about anyways. But there was also stuff that just disagreed. It was, did he come here after the Civil War, before the Civil War? So I have my friend, or actually, no, I got to tell you about the clues first. So these were the things that most of the anecdotes had in common. Is one, he was educated. So they talked about him, one anecdote had him talking knowledgeably about some literature in different places in the world. He was also skilled with languages. They said he could speak French, he could speak English. He could communicate with the Indians in their languages. So that turned out to be quite an asset for him, which we'll talk about in a minute. Plus he mined for gold. And that was one of the big things, is he reported he took out $110,000 or $1,100 in gold in 1860. And that was a lot. That's like $100,000 today. And so he was successful enough that where he mined was named after him, not Etienne Creek, but Negro Creek. And he served in the military. And this is going to be the clue that kind of led us to a lot of the better information. And he became a skilled orchardist, growing peaches and probably other stuff too. So one of the things we started with was this record of the military, because we said, if it was in the military, Civil War area, there's going to be some record. But we were surprised by the record we found. And there's actually two. This is the one that looks better on a slide, but the other one was actually a muster list for this Wilbur's Company of the Oregon Volunteers in 1856. And we were expecting a U.S. Army record from the Civil War, but here was this record from the Oregon Volunteers, 1856, well before the Civil War. So with those two, we pretty much established that he was here earlier than we expected. And then this record was even more important. There's an Oregon Pioneer Index cards compiled probably the late 1800s, because Antoine Etienne was still alive at the time. And this has his birth date in 1832 and when he arrived in 1849. And it says from Lincoln County, Missouri, which is northwest of St. Louis. And he would have been 17 at the time he came out west. And that would be a logical time for a young man, right, to come out in those days. And the other thing that was interesting, it talks about his ancestry, African, Spanish, and French. So that kind of gives a sense about his skill with languages. He very likely grew up speaking maybe English and Spanish, English, and French, maybe all three. So as you know, learning languages early is a big plus. So that was good. We actually have him kind of now where he came from. No indication here he was a slave, which a lot of the anecdotes had. And it also, well, I don't know what I was going to say about that, but it led us a lot of different ways. So where that led us was another database we looked at, the African American Experience Database, which is through the University of Washington. Our David Giblin, who's the herbarium curator, got this for us. He was looking through it. We were trying to find something about Antoine Etienne. He says, well, this is kind of interesting. And so we pulled this up. And a fellow named George Bush in 1844 came west. I don't know, any of you heard of George Bush before? Well, not the President George Bush. This was a different George Bush. And there's a plaque dedicated to him just in the last few years in Olympia. And so his story was quite interesting in that he came from Missouri. He was a farmer, born a free man in Philadelphia, served in the War of 1812, and came over. He was older. He had been worked for the Hudson Bay Company at one point. And he came out the same path Antoine Etienne would come out 5 years later. He got to Oregon City and learned that Oregon, it was a territory then, so a provincial government, had an exclusion law that said that Black people couldn't own land or even stay in what we now call the state of Oregon. the north of the Columbia River was still kind of disputed territory between Britain and the United States. That was mostly run by the Hudson Bay Company. So George Bush knew the factor at Hudson Bay Company and went to him and asked if they could settle in what we now call Washington. And he said yes, where before they had discouraged Americans or people from the United States from going. And they allowed him and 4 families that he came out with, and they settled near Tumwater. And he had a number of children, and one of them was a legislator at one point, or legislator. And so they had a lot of family history, which is great. And so there's a lot more known about him. But the question leading to Antoine Etienne was, did he face the same exclusion law? It would still have been in place in 1849. And we really don't know where he was between 1849 and 1856. So he could have gone to California and mined for gold there. He could have gone to Canada and mined for gold. He could have been in Washington too. So that's kind of a blank in our history. He's going to show up again in 1856, and that's with those military records. And then in 1860, he shows up again. This is from a book, or yeah, actually it was a book. This L.K. Hodges worked for the post-intelligencer in Seattle and was assigned to report on all the mining activity in the state. And so he came out and viewed what was then the Blewett Pass area, where a lot of mining activity was going on, and reported that in 1860, a black man took out $1,100 in gold from probably Peshastin Creek, where Etienne Creek comes in. But he surely would have explored up Etienne Creek. And one of the things with the gold is, over the years, it washes out of the mountains and gets in the creeks, right? So he would have certainly been exploring all over there. And they talk about in a season, as you saw in that one picture, it's kind of snowy and cold in there. Very steep canyon. I'm sure it's really cold there in the winter. So yeah, so he would have gone elsewhere in the winter. So the next place he shows up is in Entiat, or what we now call Entiat, the Entiat tribe. And this is a sculpture of the chief. Schaechtel is the chief's name. I think I finally got it right. Last year, I jumbled the name. This is a statue of him at that real nice park in Entiat. I don't know if you've been there. It's a nice park. And the Entiat River is right over here. And it wouldn't have looked like this. There was no lake at the time. And so Antoine Etienne was set up his household near where the Entiat tribe where their base of operations was. And he knew the chief, and there's a store, and he grew peaches there, and he mined for gold there. And there's a story that the chief's great-grandson told me, Wendell George, that I was trying to confirm this, because the question was, why did he leave Entiat? And Wendell George says that his great-grandfather told the story that there was a black man who took a little too keen of an interest in one of the chief's daughters, who the chief felt was a little bit too young. And so he told him, said, you gotta leave. And so Antoine would have left. Wendell tells me he went to what's now called Antoine Creek, north of Entiat. And I haven't researched that to know if that's totally right, but very plausible. So we do know that there's steamboats that ran up the Columbia River at the time, or later, and they would stop, and some of the peach trees that Antoine Etienne planted were still growing. They'd stop in season and harvest peaches. So there's kind of some things piecing that together. So the next time we have an anecdote about Antoine Etienne, shows up in the census in 1870. And I should thank with this, Cindy Luxus, who leads snowshoe trips for WRI, helped me with this genealogical research. And that was really a big help, because that helped us piece all this together. So he had a place near Prosser and close to the Yakima River, and he was growing peaches there. And there's a man named Harry Fisher who had a journal, and in his journal he wrote about seeing Antoine Etienne bringing peaches, a basket of peaches, over each shoulder, walking 6 miles from his farm to Prosser to sell them. So, and he had a little shack that he lived in up there. So obviously that money, where the gold money went would be an interesting thing. And maybe it was for some of the property, but that's one of the things we'll probably never know. And that was in 1870, and he died in 1904. So he was there for a number of years, as far as we know. And he, in Harry Fisher's journal, which has a number of things that aren't correct, so we don't know how correct this is, he says that Antoine Etienne said he had quite a set of memoirs about his life. And unfortunately, after he died, the shack burned and the memoirs don't exist. So we don't know, but that would have been fascinating to learn that. So Antoine Etienne's death also clouded several different stories. He's buried in Yakima, and here's a picture of his gravestone, which the cemetery has someone that takes pictures, so you find them online, which I thought was interesting. And in 1904, he would have been 72 years old, which would have been, for considering the rugged life he lived, that's pretty good. And so that's what we know of his life. So it's more than I expected to find, which was neat. And if you're interested in, if you're a writer and you like historical fiction, there's a real opportunity here to fill in some of these gaps. And if you think about, how was he received when he arrived in Oregon in 1849? And how did he learn the languages with the Indians? How did he interact with them? How did the white people treat him? So there really would be a great story for someone so inclined. So I encourage anyone here that's so inclined. Yeah, for me, historical fiction, this is about as much history as I can do, is what we're seeing tonight. Well, let's talk a little bit about how the name got changed, because that's kind of an interesting story. And so this is Jamie McDonald here. This is when he was a graduate student working in the Teanaway. That's Ingalls Peak behind him. And he was studying, let's see if I can pronounce this right, ophiolites, which are, as I understand it, which may not be right, as rocks that were under the surface of the ocean at one time and were gradually uplifted. And as you know, a lot of the Cascades were uplifted. And so he was studying those, and he needed a name for one of the formations he was documenting. And so it would be in this area of Etienne Creek. He didn't want to call it Negro Creek. That just didn't seem appropriate to him. So he ended up calling it the Iron Mountain Unit. Well, Iron Mountain is just above. I've got a picture close to it here coming up. And but it was bothering him. He says, boy, that name really shouldn't be there. And so one of his professors encouraged him in all of his studies, is when studying the geology, it's always good to study the history of the area where you are. So he tells me he was sitting in his tent up the Teanaway River somewhere, reading this book, and this book's at the library too, Discovering Washington's Historic Mines. And this is a volume for our area. And in this book is a page about Etienne Creek and about Antoine Etienne. So he took it on himself to say, I've got a good case to rename this creek Etienne Creek. And people had tried to rename it before, but what Jamie learned in talking to people about that is you need to be consistent with how other places are named in an area. So around these other creeks, there's Ingalls Creek, Hansel Creek, Chaser Creek, King Creek. So they're all pioneers in the area. So naming it Etienne Creek, he had a very good case. So he wrote it up and had help from the Washington State Geographical Names people and submitted it. And in 2009, it was approved. So and he said since then, he has had queries from other people about renaming other inappropriately named places and how to go about doing it. So that's kind of neat. And he was very helpful in digging up this information. So probably seen this sign on Highway 97, the Blewett Pass sign. And so talk a little bit about the mining history. And so Blewett between like 1878 and 1905 was quite the place. I mean, it was a booming mining town. And I don't think anybody made much money in either Blewett or Etienne Creek, but there was a lot of activity, and that could be said probably of a lot of different mining areas. But this historical marker sign tells a little bit about it. And there's also a book at the library that I think that's not my next slide, but there's a book at the library, which I'll show in a minute, that is good. But this is a claims map for the area. So here's Peshastin Creek here, and here's Etienne Creek here, and here's the town of Blewett. So there's this northwest trending formation with gold. And so you can see how it cuts across. There's between Etienne Creek and Peshastin Creek is a ridge. So this is underground. So the hard rock mining, which is tunneling and digging, that's starting from this end going this way. And then people started from this end going this way. And so they were tunneling and trying to follow these seams that had gold in it. And it's very difficult work. And you can imagine in the winter, it's pretty cold too. And what they would do, they'd pull out the ore, they'd grind it, and then they would ship it off somewhere that could process it or get it, whatever, refine the gold as best they could physically, and then send it out for more processing. But here's our Etienne Creek. So, and Antoine Etienne would have been right there at the junction of Peshastin Creek. And if you go up about 2 to 3 miles is where you find this other mining activity. And there's still, if you go today, I'll show you some pictures of some of the things, but back then there was a lot of activity. And if you're interested in that, this book is at the library, Blewett Gold History of Peshastin Mining District, 2014, so it's fairly recent. And the authors, which is Northwest Underground Explorations, the guys, their hobby was exploring old mines. And they make it very clear in the book, don't do this yourself. You know, they know, they can judge how safe these mine shafts are. But he goes in all these different claims and talks about what they found. They researched the claims history, what they pulled out of it, what they did, who was involved. It's very interesting. And I was going to try to include more in the presentation, but that just makes it very complicated. So I didn't. But if you go today, there's relics. And this is a more recent relic, but this is the fun one when we Native Plant Society, we've taken trips in. And you see a little bit of mining evidence, but then you get here and you find this. And so the road at some point washed out, obviously, and this was stranded here, but you can tell it hasn't been that long enough to grow blackberries on it, but is it still operable? I do not know. There's the Brazos mining camp not far from where that tractor is. And this is, we haven't never seen anybody here. I've seen signs that people have been here, but they've got a picnic table, they got a fireplace, and it's a beautiful setting right there. And there's the old mining road is at this stage is still, yes.
What time of year is this?
This would have been late June or early July, yeah. Yeah, and that's we'll talk about access to it is, you can't get in too early because the stream is too full. And then from August is a good time, but then from a flower standpoint, the flowers are pretty much past. So, but yeah, but I'll show you some pictures of how to get here if it is interesting to you. There's some old mechanical equipment that is there, and you can see places where people have dug. And basically this kind of mining, you dig out the dirt, you process it through some machine like this to separate something, I don't know what, and then you run it through water to kind of separate out the ores. And so mining, it's all about what you can do physically and then what you can do chemically. But panning for gold is the essence of it. It's the gold's heavier than the other stuff. There's this trailer, believe it or not, 20 years ago, someone was living in that trailer. And the book talks about, they called him Miner Jim, who had all kinds of lore about the area, not altogether true. And what I tell people about, if you read mining literature, it's like fishing stories. And so you can't believe everything you read. And the proof is the story about the goat that ate the dynamite. And then he ate a blasting cap. The goat blows up, and where the crater where the goat was is gold. That's telling you, don't believe everything you read in these mining stories. So yeah, there's somebody here, and Jamie talks about meeting this miner Jim, who was very suspicious of him until he learned he was a geologist. And then his question was, where do you think the gold is? So they had a good conversation. Well, not far from the trailer is the headquarters of the Caldo Mining Company. It's not, it doesn't appear that they were making too much money doing this. Caldo stand for Calvert and Dodge, were the partners. And this is still, there's still a commercial mining company has this claim. And there's been no activity, so I don't think they've decided it's worth pursuing. But they, up the hill was when I was there with my friends that saw this presentation, they said, oh yeah, I used to be able to see it from here, and now you can't. And you can see here's some of their tools that I have not seen them move in a couple of years, so I don't think there's any activity. There's also relics from the days when they had gondolas or conveyors bringing stuff down. And what's interesting with this picture too is if you look right here at the edge where that chair is, I don't think that chair's a relic. Notice how it just kind of drops off to the stream. Well, the one thing I learned from our trip last year was the stream has changed its course, which streams do. And it's basically has cut away a lot of this. So the stream probably used to be across the other side of the valley, and it's gradually cut this away. And so that explains why the road is real good in places, and then suddenly it's gone. And so you can imagine through the years, it's probably been, say, 30 years before the road was in good condition. And so now you kind of take what you can find. So let's talk a little bit about the plants, and which I think Karen mentioned when we got here. It's fun to combine the history with the plant life. And to me, that was one of the things that attracted me to the area. But so this plant list was 173 when their one-day trip. So as we've gone more days at different times of the year, we've grown it to 215. But it's a very diverse area in that you've got dry places, you've got wet places by the creek, you've got deep forest, you've got that area. Ted Alway did a talk here about the serpentine influence on plant life. There's a lot of serpentine areas, which are toxic to most plants. So you get these barrens. So 11 species of trees, 24 species of shrubs, 9 species of ferns, which is amazing. 15 species of grasses and sedges, and then 155 species of what we'd call wildflowers. So I've got a slideshow with some pictures just to kind of whet your appetite for it. And most of these were taken in June and July. So this is a close-up. Catherine Demerit has a great book out if you're interested. It's called Wildflowers of Leavenworth. It's at the Book for All Seasons if you're interested. And this is a close-up of sedum or stonecrop, which is a little succulent. You've probably seen it. It's maybe 4 inches tall or something like that. But it's a very, very pretty plant. And this is a very dry area. So I was really surprised this last year. We hadn't noticed it the first year, is a maidenhair fern just growing out of the rock. And you normally expect those in a moist kind of area. And then this is a close-up of strict buckwheat. Buckwheats in our area are very good plants for pollinators. And so in the dry places, there's strict buckwheat. There's also northern buckwheat is another one. And you look at the flowers up close, they're really pretty. This is a shrub, so it's a couple feet or maybe a foot tall. But it's a very pretty plant that attracts bees and flies and all kinds of stuff. Here's a close-up of little leaf montia. This flower is smaller than a dime, and but just a very elegant looking flower when you see it up close. And then these dry areas, this is near the start, where Etienne Creek meets Peshastin Creek. This is dry, south exposed slope, but there's seeps. So in the June, moisture is coming down through there. So in the seeps area, so this particular area, there's yellow monkey flower growing. Is quite prolific in here. And then fragile fern is also in here, as well as a fern called woodsia. And one of the things I like to do when I go with people is show a party trick for their friends, how to tell the difference between fragile fern and woodsia. So if we go sometime, I'll show you. But just when I looked at this, as soon as I said fragile fern, I saw this guy here and see the old fronds hanging down. See, that's woodsia, because fragile fern, the fronds are fragile and they fall off. So that's kind of a fun thing. There's other ways too, but it's not super easy to tell them apart. But you can see the moss growing in there. So it's a very wet, otherwise dry slope. And the little surprises. This is this flower here, little purple one, is called naked broom rape. And the reason they call it naked broom rape, if you look at its stem, there's no leaves on it. So it's a saprophytic plant. In other words, it's getting its nutrients from other plants. And so this particular one, this other plant, it's got a funny name, white Suxdorfia is its name. It has a pretty white flower. But it's in the saxifrage family, and that is its common host for naked broom rape. But it's one that's just fun to see. And you can see there's some of the monkey flower in there too. And this is in the first quarter mile of the road. And then you get from this dry area, you get into more deeper forest, kind of open forest. And there's goat's beard is this plant. And this is one that you don't see around here all that much. It likes moisture areas. So it's telling you something about the area, that it is cooler and moister in here. And there's, as you go in the summer, we've been on some hot days, and it's really comfortable in there. So it's a great place to go on a hot day. And then this was a real treat this last year. This is a mountain lady slipper. And we found, this was our trip probably around June 25th or so. And there was several patches of this. I don't want you to think it's everywhere, but several nice patches of it. I'd never seen so much of it. And this plant, it's an orchid, and it doesn't come up every year. And so, but we found several patches, and Mike Power is quite a photographer, and he took this picture, went back later and got this picture, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I told him the Native Plant Society has a calendar contest every year. I told him this is a prize winner if he submits it. Yes.
Is that the one that's kind of on the north side of Ski Hill?
There's a phantom orchid there too, which is a white one, which would look very different from this. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's there.
The brown around there makes me think.
I'll bet it is, yeah. Yeah, and it's around. Yeah, it's just you don't see it that often. So it was like I said, it's a real treat this year to see it. And then this is a plant in the heath family called white-veined wintergreen. It's got a good obvious name, right? White-veined wintergreen. This is probably the best specimen I've ever seen. This is at the site of the Cedar Grove campground. And this was another area that the campground's gone. I mean, the creek has reclaimed it. And just not far beyond this, again, there's a big drop off. And when we went with Mark, and he remembered his childhood being there, he says, oh yeah, this was a lot different then. And so it was fun that we could retrace where one area, there was a little wetter, that the creek probably had come in and then drained back out. And one of the plants there that we saw was this fern. It's called rattlesnake fern. And one of the mysteries about plants is always, I don't think I'll ever understand, is how you can get one individual of a species in an area. And so we found this one, and it's kind of an unusual fern. I'd never seen it before in my life. And Kate Walker, that took this picture, she found it and knew what it was, which is always nice. And so that was kind of a neat thing. But you can see how wet this area was. It's a little seasonally wet place, a little hollow that probably the river filled in at one point and then dropped out. And then this is another dime-sized flower. It's called Single Delight, and it's about 3 inches tall. And we found one. And we found it 2 years in a row, but we always have to look hard for it because it doesn't bloom for that long. And so we find it usually, we've been twice the last 2 years, once the end of June, once in mid-July. And I can't remember now which time it was we found it, but we refound it. But again, for a 3 inch, inches tall plant. It's pretty neat. It's also in the same family as that wintergreen. And you've probably seen orange honeysuckle. It's a vine, kind of a weak vine that it grows along just along the sides of the path. And tiger lilies. You know, none of these plants are super abundant there, but the tiger lilies, it seems like there's a patch where there's a lot of them. And it's not like a lot, like they're everywhere, like a field of wildflowers, but there's just enough that you say, wow, this is really neat to see all these tiger lilies. And there's quite a diversity of shrubs. This is twin flower, or twin berry, I'm sorry, not twin flower, twin berry. And just a great picture of the berries. You usually don't think that much of them, but this is a great picture. You see the detail there, and they're not edible. Deer love the plants, by the way. If you try to grow it in your garden, the deer will eat it. But it's beautiful. And then the white shooting star. And this is growing in the road, right? The creek kind of, or some water runs down the road, and these white shooting stars are there. And it's something you see around here, but not all that much. So to see them there, and again, not a great profusion, but to see, you know, a nice patch of them was quite a treat. We normally see the pink or purplish colored ones, which is a different species. And then, of course, the wild roses, it's a bald hip rose, which we're all accustomed to. And of course, the hips are used by animals, and people use them too. So let's switch now and talk about if you want to go. Oh, I had one more picture. The yellow monkey flower is always a treat. It's kind of like a snapdragon, so the same family. And so it's always fun to see. It's in those moisture areas too, either where the water's down by the road or the seeps. And I had one more yet again, another orchid. And this one, you know, this is from, I don't know if this is a bog orchid or a rain orchid. I've got it listed as a rain orchid. You probably don't care which one it is. So I got to go back and figure out what this one is. And that's part of the fun of this, is there's always something, as Joshua mentioned, there's so much to discover in this area. And you've got all these things. You've got a creek for one. You've got the mining history. You've got these crazy old buildings and artifacts, and then you've got the flowers. So it's a lot of fun. You know, we don't see a lot of animals there, which is interesting. You know, a few birds, but no deer. Never seen a deer. Not much in the way of squirrels or chipmunks even. So let's talk about getting there now. So this is the same bridge. This is in June, and you don't have to shimmy across that cable to get there. But there's two, and here's, you see the creek down at the bottom. Important thing again is you don't want to cross the creek when there's too much water, but you can get there and still see a lot even when there is too much water without crossing the creek. So two approaches. The easiest approach is 2 miles to get to this point, and you start at the Ingalls Creek trailhead. So there's a nice safe place to park your car and an old road. And you walk the road for the 2 miles. It's just a little bit uphill, a little bit downhill. It's got kind of a funny part in the middle where it slid, so it's not all that bad. It's mountain bikeable except for that funny part in the middle. And so that's the easiest way. That's the way I recommend before July, because the other way you have to cross the creek, and that is to come from the south side. This is Old Highway 97, by the way. There's a pullout about a mile south of where this bridge is, and you can park in this pullout, and then Highway 97 comes back to the road there, and then walk the road back. And that's perfectly flat. It's about a mile, except you have to cross the creek. So there's a faint path that gets you down to the creek. But again, you don't want to do it if there's too much water. But by late July or early August, there's going to be enough water. You can just wade across the creek. And there was a log at one point, but it's not there anymore because every year it changes a little bit. There's some people say, and I've seen people do this, they park on the road and then drop down to the creek and drop back up. I don't recommend that for the average visitor because it's not a very safe way to get here. So here's a picture of us on the road. This is not far from the where that picture was taken. And you can see how dry it is. That's a south-facing slope, very rocky. Oh, and here, there's Julie, yeah. There's Julie right there. And so, so yeah, as you walk along the road, it's very dry. And then you gradually get into some moisture areas and a point where you cross the creek. So the first year we were able to cross the creek on this bridge. This was in 2021. But the next year the bridge was gone. So that's how much water goes in this creek. And I had been here a week or 2 weeks before, and the water was up to about where my feet are right there. So so we were able to go across the bridge this time. And then last year, without the bridge, the first trip in June, we got to the bridge and saw plenty. We actually went up another road going up the hill for a little ways. And but we said, you know, we're not going to cross the creek. In July, we were able to cross the creek. We waited. It was quite safe, and got to the other side, which is where that tractor is. So, and then you can continue on from there. You go about a mile, and you cross the creek again on a very small log bridge, which I don't have a picture of. But you can go along. You see the road is pretty wide and very open forest. But then beyond that, you start crossing the creek like 10 more times to go the next 1.5 miles or 2 miles. And so neighbor Dennis and I, we went and you can see this is I wouldn't call it a log bridge. What would you call that? A stick bridge? And this is in early August. And so you can see there's not all that much water in the creek. So of these 10 crossings, there's some you can hop across on rocks, some you can cross on logs or branches, and some you just take off your shoes and wade. Or you say, I'm tired, I'm just gonna splash across in the water. So, but yeah, in August is a good time to keep going. And so here's another one of those bridges. And you see again, as you get farther up, there's less and less water. And then you get up to this big clearing and an old cabin. And so the cabin was one of the guys who went along on one of our trips said, you know, I used to go up there and ski and we'd stay at this cabin. And you wouldn't want to stay at the cabin now. It doesn't have a very good roof on it. And there's all kinds of junk inside and probably a couple pack rats. But it's an amazing area. And that how you get this very narrow creek and suddenly it just opens up. This is below Iron Mountain. And so this is looking towards the Tianaway area. And you had asked about the other approaches up here. Well, that's not the picture I wanted. Up here, the trail continues up that way and goes to Navajo Pass, which gets you up back into the Tianaway drainage. And so you see these stumps. When Mark is a fellow who has family had the cabin there, told me this used to be an old growth ponderosa pine forest when they were here. And they also said, you know, it didn't take long to get from where their cabin was to here because you're just walking on a road. And once you take the road out and have to kind of find your way through the forest a few times, it takes a little bit longer. But you can imagine how beautiful that must have been. And what's also interesting, it's a very different ecosystem here. You can see it's more the blue bunch wheatgrass, some different flowers, a lot of lupins being wide open like this. The trees are gone. There's a road that comes down from Schaechtel Creek down from the mountain. And you have to have it's gated, so you would have to have a key or know somebody with a key. And it's one of those roads that's all ingrown and your car's gonna get all scratched up. So I can't say I would recommend it. Might be good on a motorcycle, maybe. But one of the great explorations yet to follow is to follow this trail, or what the Green Trails map says hard to follow it up to Navajo Pass. You can make a fascinating loop trip out of this thing. Go up Ingalls Creek, come up Ingalls Creek to the Tianaway side, come down this way to Etienne Creek, back to Ingalls Creek. If you do that, let me know. I think that'd be neat. But be warned, there's places the trail is supposed to be and it's not going to be. So, pardon me?
Where is this section?
This is about 4 miles from the missing bridge.
Okay.
Yeah, and up Etienne Creek, right? Yeah, and so It's a great destination, easily done in a day. And we've done it starting at that southern approach. So you take basically 2 miles off of the approach. Yeah, and it's like I say, 10 creek crossings after the 2, so it'll be what, 12, right? So, but August is a time it's fairly feasible. But to conclude, just we talked about butterflies. So here's a wood nymph butterfly on a northern goldenrod in that meadow. And you see a little bee behind him too. So it's just a fun place, always some new surprises. We were talking about different butterflies. I was very fortunate when we went this last July, there was an eruption of great Arctic butterflies, which I'd never seen before and never even heard of till last year. And suddenly they were everywhere. It's like suddenly you were getting tired of them. There were so many. That was a pretty neat experience. So I would encourage you to check it out if you're interested. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have about the area or the history or Antoine Etienne.
If you have questions, I'm gonna interrupt real quick. We have people watching online, so I will actually come around with a little microphone so the folks online can hear your questions also, and they're not just getting answers to unknown questions and try to guess what was being asked.
Well, thank you, Rebecca.
So is this area all Forest Service, or do you go back and forth between private mining claims and Forest Service, and what's the access issues?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the access on Old Highway 97 is public. And then once you get on the road, it's mostly Forest Service. There's one small area that is private where that mining company has the claim. And there's no problem with getting across. I believe there's probably some easement somewhere, but there's no indication I've ever seen that there's no private property, no trespassing signs. Yeah. Now the claims themselves will say no trespassing. They don't want you going in and digging for yourself to see what they do, which is of course poor form. As is taking artifacts, that's supposed to be poor form too. So yeah, how about other questions?
How far up did you go?
So Clinton asked how far I've been. So I've been to where that cabin is, yes, which is 4 miles from the trail. I'd like to someday go up and camp up there and then explore that approach up to the Three Brothers to get up to Navajo Pass. Yeah, because there's trails. There used to be a lookout apparently on one of the brothers. Yeah, but of course the roads, things disappear around here. So what kind of condition the trail or road is in, I don't know, but I'd like to find out. By the way, that Three Brothers, one of the other areas, one of the reasons it's interesting is I talked about serpentine soils, and apparently that area has quite a serpentine outcrop, and there's some unusual plants up there too. So yeah, it'd be a great place to spend a few days. Yeah, but other questions?
Oh, thanks so much, Don. This was great. So I'm wondering, so Antoine Etienne has no descendants that you've been able to find at all? What about this Clemson guy that you mentioned, or was that just serendipitous, the same name? Or
yeah, I think but I think that was serendipity that there was
okay.
Travis Etienne had the same name. That's not apparently Etienne is not an unusual name, a French name. It would be like Stevens or Stephen. So yeah, so I think that was serendipity. What's interesting is Cindy made this comment in reviewing the genealogy: no record of children, and no record that he was ever married, and he seemed more of a loner. And so that would be for this historical novel, historical fiction. Great angle to play. Yeah, well.
Just a comment. If you're interested in the gold mining aspect, Nick Zentner, a geologist at Central Washington, he has some YouTubes on gold mining in the Liberty area. So you could go onto YouTube, type in Nick Zentner gold mining Liberty, and he has it's really quite fascinating.
Well, yeah, Nick on the Rocks is his the other thing you could Google if you've seen those. Yeah, and they're short too. They're very entertaining. Yeah, Liberty, by the way, would be on the south side of Blewett Pass, and it has a similar kind of geology that they had here. So yeah, it's people still pan for gold there and find some. They won't tell you about it though. Yeah. Other questions? Well, great. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming. It's been, one more question.
I have a news item.
Oh, wait, Diane, I want to make sure that people online get your news item too.
So Crim TV in Spokane reported on a $3 billion gold find in Republic, Washington
Wow.
today.
You said $3 billion?
3 billion.
Wow.
That was the company's estimate, Canadian company.
Yeah, interesting.
In the old days, they mined in Republic.
Yeah, but this might be Republic. Republic might be the new boomtown in Washington. Yeah. All right, great. Thanks everybody for coming. And if you have any other questions, I'd be glad to answer them afterwards.
And Don, thank you. Thanks again to Dawn for being here presenting. Thank you all for joining us to learn like such an interesting way with plants, connecting plants and history and learning about a local area that would be otherwise pretty hard to find information about, it seems like.
Yeah.
If you all are able to help us, this room serves many purposes and it will be turning back into a youth education space. If you're able to stack your chair, there are racks for the chairs to be stacked on. If you can stack yours on the way out the door, that helps our transition process. And once again, thank you so much for being here. I hope we'll see you at another event soon.
Thanks.